Hi everyone. I hope you're having a lovely Tuesday, and I'm so glad you could join us for the webinar tonight. My name is Tiffany Tang, and I'm the marketing coordinator for Bedford Freeman and Worth Publishers. If you're not familiar with BFW, we're the ones hosting the webinar, and we're a high school publisher that focuses on AP textbooks and teacher resources. So this year, we actually published a full AP U.S. Government and Politics program for American Government, Stories of a Nation for the AP course. If you haven't gotten the chance to check it out, definitely take a look at our online catalog, or feel free to reach out to us to request a sample copy. So let's get started. Today, we're presenting Things We Learned at the Reading, Helping Your Students Answer FRQs with Karen Waples and Ben Singh. Just some logistical stuff before we get started that I want to point out about GoToWebinar, the program we're using tonight. First off, I'd like to point out that all attendees, all of you, are muted. This is just to prevent any background noise or echo throughout the presentation. So if you're experiencing any technical difficulties or need to ask a question, please feel free to use the chat function in your GoToWebinar panel, which is the pop-up in front of your screen. If you'd like to ask a question to one of our hosts regarding content, there's a questions option in the panel, and this will allow all attendees to see your question and our answer. Now, Karen and Ben have actually built in time in tonight's webinar to answer any specific questions you have, so please don't be shy. They're here to help you out during the school year, so just feel free to ask away. And lastly, we are recording this webinar so you can review it later on. So if you do experience any technical difficulties or want to review this webinar or its materials later on, we will be sending out a follow-up email with all that information, so don't worry, we've got you covered on that front. So again, here are Karen Waples and Ben Singh. I'll hand it off to them now.
All right.
So hi everybody, I'm Karen Waples and I teach at Holy Family High School, and today I taught AP Comparative Government, which I always used to say I loved Britain the most because it never changed, and now it's changing all the time, so that's been a big challenge, as well as AP U.S. Government and Politics, and then a regular level American Government class. And so I have a great schedule. It's really fun. I'm the AP exam leader for Comparative and Government and Politics, and I actually attended that reading. And I'm the co-author of American Government, Stories of a Nation for the AP course, which was so much fun to write because I thought of my own students as I was writing it and ways to say things that were at the college level, but in ways that high school students could understand. And so that was really fun. I enjoyed that a lot. A little disclaimer here before Ben introduces himself. I was at the Comparative Government reading, and so this webinar really ought to be called Things Ben Learned at the AP reading. But he's trained me well, and he learned a lot about all kinds of FRQs and ways to approach them. And so I'll turn it over to Ben, and he can introduce himself and tell you a little bit about how he put this program together.
Thank you, Karen. So my name's Ben Singh, and I am a teacher at Cherry Creek High School, a large suburban high school south of the Denver metro area, starting my 17th year there. I teach AP US Gov and AP Comparative Politics. For the past few years, I've been a question leader at the AP US Government reading. I'm a former co-chair of the AP Test Development Committee. I did that for 2 years, a total of 6 years on the committee, and I helped author many of the teachers' resources for American Government, Stories of a Nation, the book that Karen co-wrote and BFW has published. Now, the way I put this together is at the reading, I hunted down people I really trusted, fellow exam leaders, fellow table leaders, who were working on all 4 of the questions, and I cornered them and twisted their arms and bought them beer so that they could share their insights. You know, people like Sam Fisher, if you know him, and Joe Presley, you know, people who have been around the reading a long time and people that I really trust. And I wrote all that information down and turned it into this presentation. And I've actually already started to pilot some of these tips with my own kids, and it's been pretty successful. And so without any further ado, we'll get into the first question type, which Karen will break down for us.
Thank you, Ben. And I wanted to mention that I downloaded this presentation and did a test drive with my own students. And I would agree with Ben that so far I'm seeing good results. I have more clarity now that we've talked to people who scored these exams. And so I think my kids are more clear on how to approach each of these questions. So far, at least, this seems to be working. The first question, as you know, is the concept application question. And these questions will always have a similar format. Kids will be given some kind of news story that has implications for government and politics, and then they need to respond to the scenario with information that they've learned in the class. And the A, B, and C parts are always going to be pretty similar to one another. In this case, the question is about the Alliance Defending Freedom and the Johnson Amendment, which prohibits religious leaders from certain kinds of political activity, endorsing particular candidates, contributing to political campaigns. And so kids had to take what they knew and apply it to this scenario. And so unless you covered this specifically in your class, and you probably didn't, I know I didn't, the key is for kids to have lots of practice with other kinds of scenarios so that they can take those skills and transfer them regardless of what they might get on the exam. So here are some tips. Most of you probably do some kind of current events presentations. I know sometimes teachers take this on themselves and talk about what's in the news, and then more importantly take the next step and apply the concepts they've learned to what's going on in the news. I am fundamentally lazy, and so what I do is I have kids sign up we're on block schedule, so whatever the first day of the week is, they present current events. And in my class, they do them according to the themes of the course, like liberty and order, for example, or constitutionalism. They have to find a story that represents each of those topics and tie it into those big units that we study. I also have them include a graph or chart, funny story about that in a minute, and a political cartoon as well as a quotation, because those are all things that might appear on the AP exam. And I don't want to try to outguess what's going to be on the exam. I think that's an exercise in futility. I think this exam is more about transference and skills. And so every week we look at what kids have put together and try to analyze these different components. My funny story is that the kids put up a graph about the #1 issue facing Americans, and the overriding response was health care. And then I looked at who created the graph, and it was the Kaiser Foundation. So it gave us an opportunity to talk about who's doing the polling and why they might be doing it and that sort of thing. So we kind of stumbled into an extra lesson there. So another way to do this, in addition to current events, is just find something in the news and use it as a bell ringer, and then pull something from the news and use it in FRQs, and also have them practice it in multiple choice questions. The more they can tackle these new ideas, the better prepared they'll be for the exam. And then, of course, as AP teachers, we always know that kids need to know the basic task verbs, the difference between identifying something, describing something, or an explanation that requires a connection or a because statement. And I'll show you a couple of examples here in a minute. Okay. This was what one of the AP leadership readers told us, and I think this is something I have to remind my students of all the time. You know, kids read the scenario and then they answer the question, even though the question says, in the context of the scenario, do this or that, they forget to tie it back to the scenario. And so they have to be really clear that they understand what they've read, and they may understand it beautifully, but unless they express that to the reader has no way of knowing whether the kid fully understands the story. And so they need to go back to that story in their response. I always say AP means answer the prompt. So a description is different from an explanation. I actually got this from a kid today. I asked them to explain how the Constitution supports the theory of elitism, and what I got was a good description of what elitism is. The kid was missing that because statement, and I'll show you what that looks like in the context of this question in a minute. Okay, part A is a description of an action Congress could take. So let's take a look at the example. Congress could pass a law that allowed religious leaders to speak freely about political candidates. I like this answer because it's very specific. A lot of kids will just say something like, Congress could pass a law. That doesn't put it in the context of the scenario. Technically, it's a correct answer, but it's not enough of a description for a reader to understand that the kid fully gets the scenario. So I'm encouraging my kids right now, and I have some who are still really struggling with this, to take that one step further. If Congress is going to pass a law or the executive is going to take an action, to be really clear about what that law or action is. It's an explanation, and in this case, how partisanship in Congress can prevent Congress from passing the law described above. So here's an example. Partisan division in Congress could prevent a law from being passed because Democrats and Republicans would not agree on it. And I would go further and say, and therefore would not be able to reach a majority and pass the law or pass both houses. The key to this explanation is that because statement. I know there are other ways of doing explanations, but because we're dealing with teenagers and they like clear rules, I just tell them explain means because. Every explanation has to have a because statement in it, and that forces them to make that additional link. Part C is another explanation. In this case, why the Alliance Defending Freedom might argue its constitutional rights are limited by the Johnson Amendment. So here's an example. They would argue that the amendment limits its rights because the First Amendment protects political speech. And again, you might want to point out to kids that there is a lot in here. We're not just talking about the First Amendment, but the specific protection in the First Amendment. If a kid just said because of the First Amendment, I don't know what they're talking about. Maybe they are talking about the Establishment Clause, which isn't relevant here, even though it involves religion. So again, just getting kids to close that loop and tie things down, and those because statements really help.
All right.
Okay. Before we go on to this, are there any questions about these concept application questions. I think these can be a little bit tricky for students, honestly. When I first saw the new exam, I thought this is going to be the easy part, and as it turns out, this transference skill and application skill is something some of my kids struggle with. So Ben and I would be happy to take any questions you have.
And the reality is, this, of the 4 questions, this was the one my kids struggled with the most. This was their weakest of the 4 questions. They did better on the argumentative essay comparatively, right? You know, I know 6-point rubric versus 3-point rubric on the concept application of the 4 question types.
Not to make this about you, Ben, but why do you think that is?
I think you hit the nail on the head. The transference skills, I think kids kind of lock up sometimes when, you know, it's something that is just a little odd. You know, I'm going to address that here in the quantitative analysis as well. But, you know, when it's something that's just a little off, or they don't recognize it immediately, I think they just kind of, they vapor lock a little bit intellectually and attacking it.
I think part of the reason my kids struggled, and this is completely on me, this is not on them, I spent so much time teaching them how to write the argumentation question, which is worth the same amount as this question, that I think I focused so much on that I didn't spend as much time on this as I should have last year. So that's something I plan to change for next year.
Yeah. Karen brings up a great point. All 4 FRQs are weighted equally. Each of them is worth 12.5%. And so, yeah, one of my approaches this year is I'm really going to hammer home the concept application, the quantitative analysis, and the Supreme Court comparison, not to the detriment of the argumentative essay, but I'm not going to panic as much as I did last year about the argumentative essay, because in the end, the kids can, so to speak, pad their score by racking up some points in these early FRQs, which are cognitively easier to do well on than the argumentative essay. So I plan on stressing that fact with my kids. I'm doing it already, and when we do review in the spring, I'm going to do that again. So,
yeah, I'm going to do the same thing.
So I'm going to assume we don't have any questions at this point. Tiffany?
Actually, yep, okay. I'm going to chime in. We've got 2 questions.
Okay.
First one's from Chris Gallagher, and he's asking, will it always be describe, explain, explain for the 3 task verbs?
We have no guarantee on that, but with the framework that they've set up in terms of how they write these questions, that's the most likely format. I could see maybe an identify, explain, but I'm just going to always coach my kids. I'm working to take identify out of the lexicon, at least with the concept application. I might keep it with the quantitative analysis, just so that my kids are just assume that they need to offer more than a simple 1-sentence identification on the concept application, quantitative analysis, and Supreme Court comparison.
I don't think there's been complete clarity on this issue, to be honest with you, because when I look at some of the rubrics, the Part B part is a describe or an explain. And so I think you could see a describe or an explain. My feeling is when you write practice questions, if they can explain something, they can describe it. So I'm always going to go with explain. And then if the item writers choose to use describe instead, I feel like we're covered.
But
I can't guarantee they're always going to use exactly the same language, because the rubrics I've seen offer some flexibility for the writers.
Okay.
Great, thank you. And then the other question we have is from Sean, and he asked, how deeply do students need to go as they explain? He just wants more examples of, like, more in-depth examples than what you've given.
Mm-hmm. Well, to that point, because I've been checking periodically, they have finally posted sample responses at AP Central. I don't know if anyone, I don't know when they did it, but you know, when I checked last week, they weren't there. And so they do have some sample responses at AP Central, and there's I haven't looked at the sample for the concept application. I was looking at the argumentative essay one earlier today. To be honest, there's not a ton of, the amount of depth often required is a little disappointing at the reading. I mean, being a question leader and a table leader, I often hear, well, I would never accept that in my class. And I think that's a great comment for, insofar as Karen said, if you raise the bar and you have a higher bar in your class, your kids are going to do just fine on the AP exam and for the AP explanation. That because statement really sets it up. They have to take it a little bit farther. They just can't say because of the First Amendment, like Karen said, because the First Amendment protects political speech. I would love to see, I know we kept it really short, part of that was space consideration and also simplicity's sake. I would like to see them say something a little bit more because the First Amendment protects political speech. This conservative religious group feels that religious leaders should be able to advocate for a political candidate.
And I would say this is the first year this new exam was scored. And it sounds like from what Ben is saying, the bar was set a bit lower than what many of us would like to see. That doesn't mean the bar is always going to be set there. We don't know what they're going to do in the future or if they're going to require more. And so I always ask kids to write a little bit more than I think is required just to cover the bases, because some years it seems like the bar changes a little bit depending on what happens in the pre-read when people see what kids are actually writing and where they think the bar should be set. I know that's a really vague answer because the process itself is somewhat fluid.
All right. Any other questions?
Now that we've not answered either one of those.
You're good to move on.
All right, so let's go ahead and move to the second question. And this graph is a great example of what I was talking about earlier, that kids sometimes just freeze up when they are exposed to something that they're unfamiliar with. I had lots of kids come back to me, of course, after the 48-hour waiting period, before they're posted, and they were very confused by this graph. And, I had one kid actually draw it out on the whiteboard, and I was like, guys, that's just a bar graph turned on its side. Right? That shouldn't have, but I had a number of kids who were somewhat confused by this visual representation of this data. And it was a great example. I mean, I have good kids, and they were pretty good with data, but they saw this and they're like, what does this mean? What is it showing? It's just a bar graph that they flipped horizontally. And once I told them that, they felt a little sheepish. But yeah, so I think that is a factor, and it's one of my tips later on. So question 2 is going to be a quantitative analysis. They are going to give the students some sort of data in some sort of graph, chart, or if you've looked at the curriculum and exam, the CED, I forget the whole acronym, they had a map that showed spending on education per state. And then the students are going to be given 3 tasks to complete in relationship to, 4 tasks in relationship to that quantitative data. A is going to ask them to identify some sort of data point. It could be a trend, and that gets a little trickier. B is going to ask them to sort of describe or contrast something within the data. Okay, I think they went with describe here because they didn't want to use contrast, even though that was really sort of what they were asking kids to do. Then C and D are going to ask them to take the data and apply it to some sort of concept outside of the data, but is sort of alluded to, or the data can be used to support. And in this one, it's about what is a Republican nominee going to do in a general election based on the data. And then D is about how could this data affect policy making, interactions between the president and Congress. And so C and D really ask them to step outside of the data, still use the data to support their answer, but to step outside of the data. So taking a look at this question, like I said, A is just going to be an identify, or it could be a describe. Again, I think they might go back to that describe. Now, when I say trend, that's when trend gets a little tricky is in line graphs, those sorts of things. A trend, the kids would have to identify a change over time. They'd have to identify, you know, in 1986, X number of Republicans believed this, and in 2000, that percentage had increased to, you know, X plus 10%. Trends can be tricky for kids. Often they want to just identify a particular point in time. And so one of the things I always do in class is I tend to ask kids about trends when working with data, because if they can describe or identify a trend, they can identify a particular point in time or data point in the source. Part B asks them to, again, I think it's really a contrast, but they use describe on this one. And a couple of things that popped up. This is one of the questions that I read. I read a couple of questions at the reading, and this was one of them. They might be asked to compare two or more ideas from the stimulus. This one, they had to compare two ideas, Democrats and Republicans. Students have to address both topics, concepts, groups, whatever. At least the best, most clear answers did that. I'm not saying that a kid could just talk about Republicans and not mention Democrats by name and not earn credit, but it made it harder. Students need to use comparative language, more or less, in their answer. Again, it just makes it really explicit and easy to read. And I know I always teach my kids everything that you can do to make it easier for the reader in Salt Lake City in June to read your response, the better it is for you, because it just minimizes the possibility of a mistake. I think we've got a really good process at the reading, but you know, you just want to minimize any possibility for mistakes. The best comparisons are done in one sentence. This was not my idea. I picked this up from another reader. It makes sense to me. I do think it sort of maybe pushes the level of writing, because kids have to write better sentences if they're actually doing it in one sentence. And so, for example, a kid could answer B in this way. More Republicans, 55%, believe elected officials should stick to their principles than Democrats, where only 34% believe officials should stick to their principles. It's kind of a long, wordy sentence. I guess a kid could break this into two sentences and still earn the point. But again, I think this is just really clear and explicit.
I showed this example to my students when I was doing a test drive on this, and they found it incredibly helpful to see exactly how to pull data from the chart into the sentence. Mm-hmm. I think showing them this really helped them understand maybe this level of detail isn't exactly required, but it sure helps. It's going to help them get the point. So I tell them they have got to pull data from the chart when they answer Part B for me, period.
Yeah.
That's just a rule in my classroom.
Yeah, and that's a tip that I have later on about pulling data, and it's definitely a scoring rule that you can use. Again, at the reading, that's not necessarily going to be the scoring rule, but it's your classroom, and you, again, I would encourage you, one of the things that I had to fight early on when I first started the reading is not to sort of lower my standards in my classroom, because I saw that the bar was somewhat lower than I had expected, and so I didn't want to lower the standards, and I think my kids do benefit from me having a higher bar than what they necessarily would need to earn credit at the reading. But you've got to judge your kids and what's best for your kids and for your population and for, you know, your sanity. Then C is an explain. It's really about drawing a conclusion about the data, but they phrased it in using the explain task verb. Again, they're going to be asked to connect the data to a larger political concept. This one was about what's the Republican nominee going to do in the general election based on the data. And so again, you could, a student could earn a point by answering the question like this. The Republican nominee might be more open to compromise in order to attract independent voters in the general election. This is because 57% of independents support compromise. And again, you see in this sample, I'm following Karen's scoring rule about using data from the stimulus. I'm also using a scoring rule that I use, and again, it's part of the tips here in a moment, that the kid is using, or the sample student response is using the language from the prompt, right? We saw in the stimulus, it had Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And so they're not just, saying because more people support compromise, they're saying independents, right? Because in the general election, they're going to go after independents and not really Democratic voters. They could reasonably rely on Republican voters. And then finally, part D, again, connect it to an outside concept. Again, explain how a government process idea is influenced by the data, or can be influenced by the data. And this was about policymaking between Democrats and Republicans. They need to answer how or why. And I don't know why it took me so long to come to this. How is about, the steps, a process. Why is about a motivation or a reason for doing something. I didn't really come to that until last year in arguing with a kid over a point, as all of us have done. And again, I don't know why it took me 26 years to kind of figure that out. Again, maybe I'm a little slower than the average bear. But here's a sample response. If there is divided government, notice, and we put it here in parentheses, this is a concept not inherent in the stimulus, right? Nothing in there is about policymaking other than in the prompt. If kids used divided government at the reading, they got credit. If they said, if Democrats controlled Congress and Republicans controlled the presidency, they still got the point, because they're getting at the same concept. Policymaking interactions will be slow because, and again, there's that model of using a because statement, Republican officials are less likely to compromise according to the data in the chart. Going back to the question earlier about, do we need more? No, we don't need more, but I would like to see more, and I would push my students to add another sentence. Republican officials are less likely to compromise according to the data in the chart. This means that the Republican Congress and the Democratic president are very unlikely to agree on policy. Now,
hey Ben, I've got a question for you.
Sure.
Based on giving one of these last week, and I thought I did a good job, and I thought I knew what I was doing, and then I realized I didn't. How many kids just misread the graph or chart? I had a number of kids talk about the number of people who agreed with a statement when the chart was a percentage of people who agreed. Do those kinds of slips kill the point on the exam if a kid misidentifies what's going on in the chart as raw numbers rather than percentages, or in some other way misreads the chart? How bad does the error have to be?
It has to be pretty clear. Percentages versus raw numbers was a deal breaker. If they said 66% of Republicans, because on this one it was an identify, and so they had to be able to look at a chart. And I think that that's been sort of the approach again. Who knows? It's the first year of the test, but I was part of a pilot reading for that education spending question in the curriculum and exam description. There's the rest of the acronym that showed state spending on education. And if kids said $8,000, they didn't get credit because it cut off at $7,999 on the chart. So I think because they view this as a fairly easy kind of low-hanging fruit, that they're going to have a pretty strict rule on whether or not a student earns credit.
That's good to know, because I nailed the kids.
Yeah. And yeah, because again, this is some basic literacy. And again, I know we've got a whole range of students, but you've got to push the basic literacy before you can get to the more demanding cognitive skills. Now, some of the points that I used, or the teaching tips that I used in those responses, okay, or this is actually background. Teach students how to read quantitative data. As Karen just said, we assume that they know, hey, this is a chart. How hard is it? You've looked at charts since you were in second grade, but as Karen just said, kids will use raw numbers and not percentages. Kids will misidentify the group being, the data being represented. I had, when I was reading this in Salt Lake City, there were kids who said 66% of Republicans believe that officials should compromise. I know part of that is they're just rushed at times, but you've got to really be very methodical in teaching them how to read quantitative data, X, Y axis, all those sorts of things. Use data, as Karen said, with the concept application. Use data in bell ringers, in your FRQs, in multiple choice exams. One of the things that we've done at my school is our multiple choice exams, now we can only ask 35 questions because we're a single period. I have 47 minutes on good days to teach my kids, and so we can only ask 35 questions on a multiple choice exam. But we've sort of broken it down. We have X number of comparison questions, X number of quantitative data questions, and we are trying to mirror the exam question type as closely as we can. Require students to use data in current events presentations. Karen mentioned that earlier. I require kids to have at least one quantitative stimulus in their current events presentation. And they have to, be very purposeful in how they use it and how they explain it to the class. And like I said, leading off, use unusual stimuli with your students. Get them used to a bar chart flipped on its side. And the Pew Center is a great resource for this. Find a quantitative stimulus that has two different charts about one idea. Comparing, two different groups on I don't know, the use of social media perhaps. Things that are not your traditional graphs, pie charts, line charts, that sort of thing. Throw some weird things at kids. Throw some things at kids that might be a little bit off to see if they can spot it. I mean, I'm not telling you to try to trick them. You let them know, hey, there's something off about this chart. Can you tell me what it is? And that will make them better prepared. They'll make them better readers of quantitative data. Some other, tips: avoid vague pronouns like it or they. Notice I use the word independent, Republican, Democrat, divided government. So many kids would lose points because their answer to start with was a little muddled, and then they packed a vague pronoun on top of that, and they got lost. So have them mirror the language from the stimulus or from the prompt. Should use and define the terms from the stimulus. That example with divided government, we didn't define it, but that wouldn't be a bad idea. Specific data points from the stimulus can clarify response. The only place that they're specifically required to use this is in A, but I think in other parts of their response it helps clarify. Any questions on quantitative data?
So we have 2 more free response questions left, but real quick, Derek Snow wants to know if there are any other good places to find polls, graphics, or stimuli to make their own practice questions, other than what might be in.
Like I mentioned,
one of my favorite spots, and I think it's little known, and I don't know why, there is a spot called pollingreport.com, which compiles polls from multiple sources. So you will find CNN and Marist and Fox all at a one-stop shopping at pollingreport.com. So that's one of my favorites.
I love the Pew Center, PEW. If you just Google it, because they have data on a really wide range of topics and issues. It's not just, okay, who do people support, in the Democratic nomination process. They have polls on polarization. I just had my kids look at their report on polarization. They had, or graphics on polarization. They have graphics on support for same-sex marriage, marijuana legalization, a whole host of social, political, economic issues. They do a really good job, and it's nonpartisan. Polling report is nonpartisan. I think they actually generally have a reputation as slightly conservative. Is that correct, Karen?
Well, pollingreport.com is a compilation of all the polls that are out there. So it's everything. It'll include an MSNBC poll, and it'll include a Fox News poll at the same time. And that might be a nice side-by-side comparison. And pollingreport.com is one-stop shopping for that, and it's free.
Yeah. So's Pew. Gallup has some stuff online. I've found Gallup is not as easy to search and navigate. And then you've got your traditional sorts of news organizations who do polling. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Economist. Unfortunately, The Economist, Wall Street Journal behind paywalls. I don't know if your school may have a subscription, but traditional news sources also can be a good source of polling or visual data.
Great, thank you guys.
Okay, on to the SCOTUS comparison free response question, and I learned so much that will help my kids based on Ben's sources, so I'm excited to talk to you about this one. This, I'm sure you've all seen it. It's a comparison of Hernandez versus Texas and Brown versus Board of Education. So A is always going to be identify the clause. I'm sure you've all figured out kids don't know what a clause is. So you need to spend some time talking about how it's part of an amendment or part of an article in the Constitution, not the entire article and not the entire amendment. And I've got a slide coming up that will clarify that. And then B, explaining how the facts in the cases lead to similar or different conclusions. And then C, something outside of the question, again, takes them beyond the Supreme Court to how an outside actor might have an impact. So let's move ahead and I'll clarify some of this. So part A is to identify a clause common to those cases. I thought this was going to be easy for kids. They don't know what a clause is, and so you have to be very specific. There is no such thing as freedom of religion. Well, there is, but it's not a clause. So kids need to talk specifically about the Free Exercise Clause, or in this case, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And that's just going to require lots of practice and careful reading on your part when you score this portion of the question. Part B. I learned the greatest tip from Ben's sources on this. So Ben, go ahead and put up the fact sandwich. I'm using this with my students, and it works great. And I wish I had known this last year. So the first sentence is to state the similarity or differences between these two cases. And then, and I think this is where kids got in trouble, they have to discuss the facts in each case. So facts from the required case and the facts from the non-required case. And then the last part of the sandwich is this is how they're similar or this is how they're different. So Ben, if you could go on to the example. This really helped my kids. So the first broad statement is both cases involved race discrimination. Then the kid talks about the required case, which is Brown, and what happened, school segregation. Then the next sentence is the non-required case, which was Hernandez, and this was a policy that kept Latinos off of juries. And then sum it all up. The Supreme Court ruled that the discrimination violated the Equal Protection Clause in both cases. So that's the similarity. I really like this formula. I used it with my kids and gave them a homework assignment. And they didn't all get it, but most of them did. I'd say about 80% first time through got this because they had this fact sandwich formula in front of them. This was homework, so they could look at this formula as they wrote their answers. My hope is eventually they'll have it internalized, and that will help them nail Part B. Okay, moving on. Part C is how something outside of the court might influence the decision, and so this was also very helpful for me. Describe a strategy and a target as well as an outcome. So strategy, target, outcome. And here's the example. Interest group could file a lawsuit. That's the strategy. The target would be the judicial branch. That's kind of included in the concept of a lawsuit. And then the outcome, the goal would be to extend civil rights to other groups or in different situations. So again, this is just a way of forcing kids into a formula that will make them answer the question. My kids had this in front of them when they did their homework. They did really well. At some point, we'll take this as a free response question in class where they don't have this in front of them, and hopefully they'll have this internalized.
Before we go on, just a quick rubric point on Part B, if I'll go back here. If you look at Part B, this is actually a two-pointer. The minute the kid says something right about the required case, so the minute the kid said, sorry, going to the example, Brown, the school district segregated African American and white students from each other, they earn 1 point. When they kind of tie the cases together and lay out the facts and why the facts led to a similar decision, then they earn that second point. The College Board, in putting together the rubric, I don't know why they didn't change it into two different tasks. I mean, probably for readability and the question flow. But this is 2 points. So this is a 1-2-1. 1 point in A, 2 points in B, and 1 point in C. The minute they say something factually correct about the facts of the case in this example, they will earn a point. All right, sorry. Okay, so.
Okay, so some tips for this. Have students make flashcards or have them do some other kind of review, a Quizlet for the amendments that are listed. There are some that are required in the Supreme Court cases, and these are the ones that you will find in the required Supreme Court cases. And of course, some of these, there might be some cases that involve a couple of things. But have them for each Supreme Court case identify an amendment, and I would add a clause of the Constitution. So for the Lopez case, for example, the 10th Amendment would be the amendment we would consider, but they would also consider the Commerce Clause, which is the basis of the decision. So I would expand this a little bit. Now that I'm looking at this slide, I would say amendments and clauses. I would add that. For each SCOTUS case, I have a sheet I give kids with facts, the issue, which they always struggle with, the decision, and the reasoning. And so they'll have 15 of these sheets by the end of the year, and then they can, I teach seniors, so we'll see how much they review them, but theoretically, they will have those sheets with these major concepts that they will be able to review. Go ahead, Ben.
Okay.
I did this last year, and I hit the jackpot. Have kids write their own SCOTUS question and response. And when I say I hit the jackpot, I don't mean that we outguessed the test, because I don't believe in outguessing the test. I think that's just wasted time and energy. But I think once kids put their own question together, they have a much better understanding of how to work backwards and approach the question. The hint for kids was find the required case in the textbook and look at other cases nearby that you can use for comparison. And then I had a couple of kids pick cases that involved different clauses of the Constitution, and I knew those kids were really lost, and I was able to spend some time pulling them aside and going over it to make sure they understood the concept. It really helped me know which kids had internalized this and which kids were struggling with this concept of what a clause is and what similarities are and what differences are. And as I mentioned earlier, since I am fundamentally lazy, I had them do all the work. They wrote the question as an assignment, and I reviewed their questions to make sure that they were acceptable, and then the second part of their assignment was to answer it. And I will say one girl picked Hernandez and Lopez, and that was just kind of a fluke. It wasn't about outguessing the test, but she was really cute. She came out after the exam, and she's like, I have something really important to tell you in 48 hours, which was kind of cute.
That is cute. Yeah, I'd like to echo something. I think a lot of teachers spent a lot of time last year trying to teach kids associated cases to the required cases. Like, hey, Brown is required. Here are 3 other cases that are similar to Brown. And as Karen said, I think trying to outguess the test or doing that ends up, wasting some valuable time or taking up, I shouldn't say waste, because, anytime kids learn about cases other than the required cases, like I teach my kids Oberfell because I think that's a really important case. I teach my kids Heart of Atlanta because I think that's an important case. But I don't do so in the context of, hey, I think they're going to ask about this or they could ask about this in relationship to Brown or whatever other required case. I do that because they're interesting cases and they're important cases. They're going to give the kid everything they need to know about the non-required case that they're using to compare to the required case. And so I think some teachers could probably use some of that time differently this year, and that's been my big piece of advice to teachers that I've talked to at APAC this last summer. I'm going to be at NCSS in the fall, and that's going to be something that I throw out at NCSS as well.
Having students write their own Supreme Court question and write their own response gave me a lot of clarity about exactly where they were in terms of this skill. So that's something you might think about.
All right. Any questions about Supreme Court comparison, Tiffany?
I'm not seeing anything. It looks like we're going to go a little bit over time with the last question, though.
Okay. So let's get into the last question. And again, I think I kind of alluded to this earlier. The argumentative essay question is the one that I know it had me freaked out, and I think it had lots of AP Gov teachers freaked out across the country. And I think a lot of that stress ended up being unwarranted because, A, it's worth just 12.5% of the score equal to the other 3 FRQs, and B, kids actually didn't do all that badly on the argumentative essay. They don't have score distributions up, but I was at Steve Meinhold's breakdown of the AP exam at APAC, and he was very complimentary of teachers and the job that teachers across the country did in teaching the argumentative essay. So it did not go, or it wasn't nearly as bad as people thought. So as you can see, the argumentative essay last year was about federalism, and kids had to argue whether or not expanded national power was a good thing or a bad thing for policymaking. And they had to use at least one of these 3 documents, the Articles of Confederation, Brutus number 1, or Federalist number 10. And on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see what they have to do. They have to have a defensible claim or thesis. They have to support it with 2 pieces of evidence, one of which has to be from the foundational documents. The other piece can come from course concepts or another foundational document. They have to have reasoning, and then they have to do a refutation concession or rebuttal, an RCR. So some teaching tips. The claim or thesis has to be arguable. And one way to help kids do this is have them really write 2 elements. Take a position. The growth of national power benefits policymaking. That's their position. Great. Awesome. Then they have to add a because statement to establish a line of reasoning or an argument. The growth of national power is beneficial because, and we'll see here an example. I'll throw it out there. A couple of other things before the example, sorry. Encourage your kids to put it in the introduction, and in fact, I've taught my kids, you know what, you don't really even need an introduction. You need to have, just do a one-sentence thesis statement as your introduction. I know that's not good writing style, but I'm trying to simplify a little bit for kids and again, make it easier for the readers in June to pick up on my kids' thesis statements. In my class, I am not awarding the point for the thesis unless it is in the introduction. I'm really trying to reinforce that it has to be in the introduction. And there were some groans and some complaints, but it is what it is. Here's the sample thesis statement. The growth of national power has benefited policymaking because it has helped ensure all citizens are treated equally regardless of where they live, right? So it's sort of a civil rights, civil liberties sort of argument, but they take a position and then they give us because or a line of reasoning as to why that position is the correct position, right? The evidence. They should write 2 paragraphs, one for each piece of evidence. And I've taught my kids and I've used with my kids the kind of the classic claims evidence reasoning format that a lot of English teachers use, and I know some social studies teachers use this. And so in the first sentence, they just need to state their claim, okay? Just lay it out there. Answer the prompt, so to speak. Provide some evidence, and then explain how this evidence supports their claim or thesis. Now, my kids made the mistake on their some of my kids, I should say, made the mistake that they saw this model and they're like, okay, I need 1 sentence, 2 sentences, 3 sentences. No, I told the kids, right, that don't think of sentence 1, sentence 2, sentence 3 as just sentences. And so I need to change this PowerPoint perhaps. I didn't use the PowerPoint with them, but this model should be, step 1, state the claim. Step 2, provide the evidence. Step 3, explain how this evidence supports their claim or thesis. Because I got some very mechanically grammatical or very interesting structured sentences. Reasoning can be anywhere in the response, but ideally they should include it here. If they follow this model, they'll include their reasoning in their evidence. And I tell my kids to do reasoning for both pieces of evidence. Just never hurts to have an extra piece of reasoning.
I am doing the same thing because that reasoning point is kind of hanging out there, and to be honest with you, I've never completely understood how it's scored or why it's just dangling as a single reasoning point, but I figured I could cover all my bases if they did it with each piece of evidence. Like somewhere in there has to be reasoning, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, I encourage my kids to have reasoning with both pieces of evidence, again, because I'm pushing this claims evidence reasoning sort of setup. And while we don't have examples of evidence and reasoning in here, again, from a space standpoint, there is now a sample argumentative essay posted, and I've got it up here on my phone, and they've got some pretty clear, they sort of follow this model. And so you can kind of see that this claims evidence reasoning in action. All right? Refutation, concession, and rebuttal. Okay? Again, sort of 2 things. They have to state, or I should say describe, an alternative perspective. Some may argue that policymaking is hurt by expanded national power. Then they have to tell why they're going to, or how this is wrong, refutation, how this may be right, concession, or they may have a point, but their point's not better than my point. And of the 3, refutation is really sort of the simplest. And again, I picked that point up from Steve Meinhold, the chief reader at APAC. He just said, kids, why would kids write a whole essay and then tell us why they're wrong at the end? Why would they concede? Was basically one of the messages he sent. Because I guess kids just did not handle concession very well.
I'm telling them not to use concession, honestly.
Yeah, I'm telling my kids really
just forget that.
Yeah, I'm telling my kids just to do refutation. And so, again, from the sample that's posted on the College Board website, the kid has a pretty clear refutation. Says, although some states' writers may claim that expanding the powers of the national government is harmful or could infringe on on people's rights, as stated in Brutus number 1, this simply would not happen as often as some would claim. Within the federal government, there exist several forms of checks and balances and separation of powers. And he goes on, or she goes on. So they stated the alternative perspective, and then they laid out why that alternative perspective is not correct. They engaged in refutation. So a couple of tips here. Multiple opportunities to read, use, discuss the foundational documents. Come back to them again and again and again. I would argue, maybe I have a semester-long course. I have 18 weeks. There's 19 or 9 documents. I'm trying to do a document of the week, and that means every document gets 2 weeks. And you got to come back to that time and time again. Again, incorporate.
And also make sure kids can match the right document with the right argument. I'm having trouble with that.
Yes. Oh,
I'm having kids picking the wrong document to make their arguments, and so before they write their effort or their argumentation question, going through in class, what are all the ways you could use this? Yeah.
I had kids use Brutus number 1 to try and support elite democracy, which is not correct. Incorporate, again, questions about foundational documents in your multiple choice exam. Remember that without a thesis, the best score a student can earn is 1 point. Incorporate this into your scoring. Kids are going to kick and scream. I just graded my first round of argumentative essays. I had kids who had everything but a thesis, and they got 1 out of 6, which turns into a 50% in my class. You've got to hammer that home. That thesis statement is so important for students to have. Again, though, you've got to judge your audience, your population, but I think this is an important teaching point. Practice writing thesis statements and refutation, concession, rebuttal frequently. You don't have to do a full-length argumentative essay. You could just throw out a prompt and have the kids write a thesis statement and a refutation all at the same time. You've got 4 sentences to grade, or 4 sentences to, maximum of 4 sentences maybe to discuss or workshop in class. But this is something that could be done as a bell ringer. This could be something done as an exit slip from class, but you should really, really practice this as often as you can. But just to, last little idea here about the argumentative essay is the message I'm trying to deliver to my kids is don't freak out. This is 12.5%, just like your others.
Yeah.
Breathe, relax, keep it simple. All right, Tiffany, do we have?
And I had a kid who could not write a rebuttal to save her life last year, and did well on the exam. And I got to thinking about it. That's 1 point out of part of the exam. That's 12.5%. So it's too bad she didn't learn that skill, and I wish she had. But I agree with you. Don't freak out if there's little pieces of this they don't get, as long as they get the big picture.
Very much so. Tiffany, do we have any questions?
So it doesn't look like we have any questions about the last few questions. So I guess we'll wrap up.
All right.
Thank you so much, Karen and Ben, and thank you to everyone who stuck around with us. Just real quick, again, this webinar has been recorded, so in a few days you can expect a follow-up email with a link to the recording and the PowerPoint. If you have any further questions, whether it's about the FRQs or about Karen's book, you can email us at hsmarketing@bfwpub.com. I put that email in the chat for you guys if you want to just copy it. And I'll leave it up for another minute so you can copy it down. Any last, Karen, done?
See my email and Karen's email on the slide. Please don't hesitate to contact us if you have any questions. And that website there, I think I have this presentation posted but not recorded, just the presentation itself. But there are also other presentations that I've given as part of webinars, and Karen and I have given at different conferences. So it's also a resource for your use as well.
And I just want to invite you to use part of this presentation if you feel like it would be helpful with your kids. Feel free to use it with your students.
Yes, very much so.
All right. Thank you again, everyone, and have a nice night.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. Bye, Karen. Bye, Tiffany.
Thanks, Tiffany. Bye, everybody.